in California, a private investigator is really not supposed to investigate capital crimes. Therefore, she had to have some excuse to be around there and gathering the clues.
So she was actually, what, a part of the co-op or hired by the co-op
She
to
was
do
an
investigative work for their, they were defense firm?
Yes, defense attorneys, and to do basically interviewing of witnesses, anything that they needed someone who was a good interviewer to go into.
So you created, as I recall, quite a family in that old, what was it, they were in kind of an old Victorian?
Yeah, they were in an old Victorian in a funny little semi-rural part of the city.
Which today, of course, would be beyond all price.
Yes, unfortunately.
So San Francisco, not only has your character evolved, but San Francisco real estate is...
Yes, she's lucky she bought her own house when she did.
Very, very true. So what happened with the co-op?
The co-op progressed for a number of years, and it was funny because initially in Edwin there was one character in the co-op who had a name besides Sharon. That was her boss, Hank Zahn. And as the years went by, I kept adding other real people, real names, real backgrounds to it. So I had quite a large cast of characters. But I began to see that this type of thing, law firm, which evolved from the poverty law movement in the early 70s, was not going to work in the 90s.
Right.
So I had them dissolve the co-op, and Sharon established her own agency, first with offices there in the building with them, and then moving to a pier on the waterfront. And now that agency has taken off, and she's adding more and more employees all the time.
That's true. She went, what, down to the Embarcadero?
Yeah, she's on the Embarcadero on an old pier.
I've often traveled from Sausalito. My brother-in-law lives, and if you knew Peter, this sums him up, he lives on a houseboat.
In the colony there.
In Sausalito. And the most convenient way, if you are
The ferry.
with Peter, is to take the ferry, you know, and come into San Francisco. And I was an undergraduate at Stanford. And so I remember San Francisco, in fact, from the late 50s.
Oh, yeah.
And I've watched it, you know, when Bayshore was the only freeway, and it seemed like this incredibly glamorous, you know, enormous highway. And gosh, I drove up it last year or so, and it's disintegrating, you know.
Oh, yes, it's totally changed.
It's kind of like Highway 5, you know, the I-5 is that it just is no longer, you know, what it was back. But anyway, that whole area around the Embarcadero has changed in these 40-some years. It's unbelievable.
Yes, in fact, in the last 5 years or so, the book that I'm working on now, which will be out this time next year, it's called Dead Midnight, it centers in that area. And what I'm talking about is how the lifeblood of the city essentially has moved from the traditional areas such as Union Square or the financial district down to what we call South Beach or south of Market. And the waterfront, the coming down of the Embarcadero Freeway, which came down in the quake of '89, changed the whole face of the city. People looked around and said, oh, you know, that's what I could see in the 50s. It's back. I can now see Alcatraz and Treasure Island. And they decided just to raise the whole thing.
I thought it was a wonderful, I mean, it was a terrible thing that impelled it, the earthquake, but I did think that the transformation back to the way the city used to look.
It makes a total difference.
It really does. In fact, when I was in Boston recently, I thought to myself, you know, too bad they can't just knock all this down if they ever get the dug. Maybe they can do something with it. But I agree. I mean, San Francisco really is much more about the bay than it is about the ocean. I mean, you can go off, and there is a western front.
Section, yes, but the bay is really the focal point.
Absolutely, looking out to Treasure Island or up to Alcatraz, and you know, I love to take one of those evening cruises.
Those are nice.
They're just gorgeous, and you can sail all around that. So I can see that that all of this would change and would affect Sharon. It's interesting that you're having her react to all that, even though she's not aging in real time. The city must be changing in real time for you, though, as you're writing it.
I've had to ask the readers to suspend their disbelief on the fact of aging. She was around 30, as she put it, in Edwin of the Iron Shoes. She's now 41. And she has aged. Her circumstances have changed, but there will be instances where one book, The Earthquake of '89, hasn't happened, And the next book is taking place 2 months later, but it has happened. So readers, I just ask them not to look too closely at the time element.
Well, I think you couldn't really keep Sharon credible for what she does if she gets too old. So there's a very good reason for slowing all that down, and I don't think readers really care. It was just kind of an interesting point.
I think they find it amusing more than anything.
Probably. You know, in the preface, I can't remember if it was to P is for Peril or O is for Outlaw, Sue Grafton does write that she has kept Kinsey deliberately in the mid-'80s because she wants her to still work the way a real PI that she knew anyway would work, which is before computers and cell phones and so forth, where she's really doing street work and whatever. I mean, PIs today, I think, probably function quite differently.
Most of them don't go out of the office.
And so you really need to keep Sharon to be interesting as a character on the move and all.
Yeah, what I've done that by having her be somewhat technologically challenged, which I also am, so I can represent that carefully. But she also is not a desk type of creature. She chafes at being at her desk for very long, so she delegates.
True. But you do have to deal with the idea that, you know, cell phones have really changed. I watched the original version of the Thomas Crown Affair and the remake not too long ago. And that whole scene in the original version when they're all rushing into payphones, you know, to make the caper come off. Today, everybody would be, you know, there's so much that you can't bring off anymore. I was just reading a missing air plot, for example, and of course the question comes into your mind now, well, why don't they just do some DNA testing?
Yeah.
And, you know, we don't have to speculate whether this child is a substitute for one that died. We can just find out.
Yeah, I found that I have to complicate my plots more because of the ease of getting information. She calls the office, she talks to Mick. Mick's on his computer, he's got it in a few minutes. So it has to be slightly confusing information that requires more tracking down.
Yeah, or you do have, I remember one case, there's a kidnapping case, right? Is that the one with the child?
Yes.
And that
the
one,
Caribbean?
Well, you know, I'm trying to keep them all straight, but I know
so
there was
am I.
one where she also had to fly in a plane. I mean, you know, she does a lot of, I think you're, and I'm assuming that you yourself are a pilot.
I'm not licensed, but I could get you up and down in one of those.
Well, you obviously love the idea.
Yes.
And so Sharon took flying lessons and is now a pilot and buzzes around in a lot of the books. But there was one where it seemed to me, if I remember it right, there was a child that was kidnapped. Didn't she have maybe Middle Eastern parents or something?
Yes, and they were going cross country from Florida trying to get her back to California in a 2-engine plane.
Right.
Which was a real challenge because most planes that you can rent like that don't have much range, so they were stopping all over the place to refuel.
Sure. But when you've got that going on, then all this technical stuff doesn't really come into play anyway, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's still basically an action, you know, chase kind of situation.
You try to keep most of the technical stuff out. The technical things that would make it unbelievable if you didn't include it are in there, but I don't go through, for instance, if she takes off in the plane or lands, I don't go through every one of the dozens of little actions she'd have to do to get there.
Oh, absolutely. That would be very
It would
boring
be
for the
boring.
reader.
It would be boring for me to write.
Sure, but it does make her mobile, and one thing that I do think has been interesting about the series that has kept it kept it fresh is that you have put her in different locations.
Yes.
I think the one where she went to, is it Mono Lake?
Yeah, it's Mono Lake. It's been renamed and moved a little bit, but that's the prototype for it.
That was a fascinating landscape. It's an
It is a
interesting story,
fascinating
too. I was
place.
asked, it's one of my favorites of all your plots,
Oh,
and I'm
really?
going totally blank on the name again. Is that the...
Where Echoes Live.
Right. Because I just wasn't familiar with all the geology.
It was a place that I had wanted to go for years. You know, this lake with all the towers of vegetation exposed, and it was also very endangered at the time, so it was a perfect reason to go there and explore the country, and I just fell in love with it.